Produce the film. Come here, Ash Carter. Thank you.
Thank you. I hired an imposter at a very reasonable rate, but he didn't. He didn't follow through. Thank you for being here, and thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. As I said before you arrived, I think context is important in this film. I think it was 1989. It's before the election of Mayor Dinkins, but in the wake of the Our Beach incident, when I think it was a group of Italian-American teenagers, that killed essentially a black kid. And
Yes.
so can we just sort of give a little bit of an idea to us?
So a bit of context. There's a few names at the end of the film to whom the film is dedicated, and all of these are victims of either racist killings or police brutality. So the film is very direct and deliberate in who it's dedicated to. In the final voiceover by Samuel L. Jackson, a.k.a. Mr. Senor Love Daddy,
Yeah.
he's directly breaking the fourth wall, as he does many times in the film, to invoke the audience to go out there and vote for David Dinkins, who was duly elected shortly after the film. In terms of a context of Spike Lee's career, this is his third film, his third feature film, following She's Gotta Have It from 1986, which has been recently adapted into a Netflix serial, and School Days, which was a musical about ethnic tensions in a historically black college based on his own experiences at Morehouse. And these are both films that are very ambitious and experimental, formally and thematically and politically. And Do the Right Thing is a studio picture. And this is a real leap for him. And it's a very brave and bold piece of filmmaking. I'd like to talk about the form specifically, because one thing that I notice about Spike Lee, because he doesn't mince words in the press and he deals with very controversial themes, often it's the politics of his films that are spoken of first and foremost, and he's forgotten about as an artist. And what you're seeing with Do the Right Thing is an artist at the height of his powers. He's working with the cinematographer Ernest Dickerson on a 6-week shoot, which was often raining, to make it look like the height of summer. And the costume designer Ruth Carter, who's recently done the costumes for Black Panther, and will surely be Oscar nominated for that next year. So, in terms of the form and the technique he's using, he's really at his height here. So he's been making films for only 5-6 years at this point, and this is a real breakthrough for him.
Yeah, and when you mentioned School Days, School Days was a musical, but I was watching this film again yesterday, in fact, or the other day, and it strikes from the very beginning how unusual. It has this sort of hyper-realism. So it feels like a musical almost right away. Just the use of color is so overly non-realistic, and the timing and the sort of almost Brechtian detachment to what happens and the structure. Can we just go a little bit deeper into the...
Yeah, every time I watch this film, I notice something new and different about it. It's an incredibly unusual film structurally, and the way that it introduces you ensemble style to... It takes maybe 20 minutes to introduce all the characters before any sense of a narrative coheres. And you're right, there is a real musicality to it, not just in the dialogue. There's a kind of, me, who are you, hey, hey, that kind of dialogue between Sal and his two sons and Mookie. There's a choral aspect to that. Then, of course, you've got the corner boys, who effectively act as a Greek chorus.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you have the score, which is arranged by Bill Lee, Spike's father, and then also the soundtrack, of which Public Enemy, Fight the Power, acts as the clarion call right at the beginning. And it's quite subtle, but just before Public Enemy kicks in, you hear, just over the Universal logo, the African-American national anthem by James Weldon Johnson, Lift Every Voice and Sing. So from the very first second, there's music. And there was actually two soundtrack albums. You had the score and the soundtrack, and they were both hugely successful. So music, and there's a very theatrical element to this film. It's also rooted in African-American art traditions, like Romare Bearden, the kind of cut-up collagist painter. So there's so much visually in there that you need. It's almost overwhelming, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. And you mentioned Fight the Power, and I think that the Public Enemy song was written, if not for the film, together with the purposely together with the film. So this was kind of a pivotal film for the way hip hop and cinema interacted so much between the end of the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, there'd been a few stabs at hip hop cinema beforehand, things like Wild Style and a great documentary called Style Wars, which if anyone's interested, I would say check out on YouTube.
The Run DMC film as well.
Tougher than
Tougher
leather.
Than Leather,
right?
yeah.
Wow, we should play that next week.
I love that. And Spike didn't want to direct it, correct?
Did he not?
No, he said it was gangster stuff.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. But this film, this is an attempt to synthesize hip hop aesthetics and sonics with the kind of the main narrative, rather than just have it be about hip hop artists, etc. So it's a kind of breakthrough in that respect. He hired Chuck D to write the song, and he came back apparently with one effort, and Spike just said no. So he went back and worked on it, and eventually came back with Fight the Power, which is not just used for the opening sequence and is very iconic. It's also Radio Raheem's song, and it's very symbolic because he's an inarticulate character. You have that ridiculous scene with him and the Korean shopkeepers where they cannot get in touch with each other verbally. So Public Enemy does his talking for him. So I think it's perhaps Spike Lee's way of saying how hip-hop and rap music is a form of storytelling, and it's expressing ideas and thoughts and things that have been repressed that young black kids can't, are not able or willing to express. But that's what Radio Raheem, that's the function of that song for him and for the film at large, I think.
I just arrived in New York when the film came out, and I remember even before it opened, and it was after the Cannes screening, it split the critics dramatically. And I remember people like Joe Klein and David Denby, but even a black writer like Stanley Crouch, a cultural writer Stanley. They were very against the film. They said that the film was meant, what was intended to start a riot and basically to incite people to just sort of opt for violence.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come out and say straightforward, a lot of that criticism was out and out racist. They said that this film, young black kids would go and riot after they'd seen it, that it was an incitement to violence, which is a really reductive and disappointing way to read that film, which is ambiguous and dialectical all the way down to the final quotations between Malcolm and Martin. You can look at that film and think it's a film that encourages you to think for yourself. There's no easy answers in that film. Between what happens with Sal and Radio Raheem, at every level of the film there's a tension, and it's not a film that says go out and riot and fight. It's a film that demands thought and reflection of its audience. It's funny us coming up here straight away. I think it's one of the films that almost requires 10 minutes to go and sit down with yourself and really process.
I mean, by watching, I remember the criticism, the original criticism at the time, but by watching it the other day, I was thinking, and how polarized any conversation is in 2018. This is so nuanced. There is so much depth to it that it's amazing how some people couldn't see it at the time, but I guess things have changed.
But that's endemic to what Spike's faced throughout his whole career, which he's been tarred and targeted as the angry black man from day one, because he's dared to have political opinions. And people have, I think, boxed him into a corner. And he's, as you quite rightly mentioned, he's been pilloried from all sides. It's not just supposed liberal critics like Denby and perhaps Joe Klein, but even Amiri Baraka turned up on the set of Malcolm X to say, you're not black enough, you're a buppy, you don't have the authenticity to make this story. So, and that is a function of, I think, that the solitude of Spike. He's part of this lineage of black artists in America who've been the one at any given time, whether it's Sidney Poitier, he was the one. So he was very lonely. He was a trailblazer, but yet he got it from all sides. And the reason this whole idea of the one emerges is because of many industrial and social factors that make the industry what it is. And I think suddenly now we're seeing, I say suddenly, it's been many years in coming, but finally today we have something approaching a multiplicity of voices. There isn't just the one. Ava DuVernay's doing great stuff, Barry Jenkins, Ryan Coogler, and they're giving these guys money to make proper work and art, and hopefully we'll see sustained careers. But Spike, for many, many years, was the one.
But I think, I mean, as you said before, there is something about Spike's persona
His name.
that you know, makes it easier to sort of marginalize him as the angry black man, or you know, someone who wants to pick a fight. But I think, you know, I think what's interesting to me, and he mentioned, I was reading an interview he gave on Do the Right Thing, and he said, oh, they will attack me because the black middle class will not like this because I don't offer a lot of positive roles. And in fact, he was attacked for that. And I think it's interesting in some of his films, in several of his films actually, and I was thinking Bamboozle, but I was thinking of Get on the Bus, Girl 6 to a certain extent, where he manages to be critical of the black community. He's not tender. He offers all kind of perceptions.
He's not a warm hug type of guy or filmmaker. Bamboozled in particular is this is a film that I watched far more times than is healthy.
This is the one you wrote a book about.
I wrote a book about this in 2015. Has anyone in the room seen Bamboozled? A few people. So the premise of this film is a frustrated African-American TV executive who's fed up of not being able to make intelligent and progressive work about black people, black middle-class families. So he decides that he's going to get himself fired and take a nice severance package by coming up with the most offensive idea he can. So he hires two African-American tap dancers or street performers. He gets them to put on blackface, and they do a contemporary minstrel show. And lo and behold, like the producer's style, Mel Brooks style, this becomes a huge success. And this film is one of the most difficult films, I think, imaginable in terms of the demands it makes on an audience. And it's angry and critical in all directions. It's angry about the black performers who allow themselves to be sold out in such a way or represented in such a way. But moreover, it's angry at the structures and the systems that allow these things to happen and to be perpetuated. And I think when we look at questions of representation, something I wrote about in the book, once a year we funnel all of our energies in the industry towards the Oscars, and we get very excited and agitated about who's going to win this, who's going to win that. But we rarely talk about what these roles mean and what's actually happening on the screen. So if you look at some of the last few Oscar winners, even though they're heralded as big breakthroughs, often black actors are still playing slaves or welfare queens or criminals. I'm thinking of Denzel in Training Day. And this is not to, or Lupita Nyong'o from 12 Years a Slave. And now this is not to denigrate the quality of the roles themselves, but it's to ask maybe a broader question about what kind of representation the industry still venerates. And that's where Spike comes into it with a film like Bamboozled, where he's extraordinarily critical of everybody within the system and perhaps even himself for participating in it.
And I think Chirac was also part of the same way of
Yeah, this is Chirac, Spike Lee's very strange musical from a few years ago. Set in, it's a gun violence comedy musical, everyone's favorite genre.
Set in Chicago.
Based on Lysistrata, the old, where the ladies refuse to give it up until the killings stop. There you go. And some people gave him money to make it, and he did, and it's a really interesting movie. But again, he does these things, which is kind of interesting, that many filmmakers and artists in general are advised not to do, which is to fill their film with contemporary references. So in this film, you have the Mike Tyson, very prominently displayed in the frame. You've got Mike Tyson, you've got the Tawana Told the Truth,
Broadway.
which is Tawana Brawley, the lady who claimed that she'd been raped, yeah. And there's references to a certain Mr. Trump as well. Good job he disappeared from public view. And you know, that's something that Spike Lee does. He fills the frame with pop cultural references, which are directly attempting to speak to his audience then. But in a film like Do the Right Thing, when you see history repeating itself, with incidents like Eric Garner, who was killed by the police chokehold a few years back. And Spike actually cut this sequence together with the Eric Garner footage. And you see that these films, the films that he makes, because he's dealing with inherent issues that are American values, I suppose, that are very endemic and essential to the fabric of American society, that they never go out of style, however disturbing that may be.
And since you mentioned the Oscars and representation, if I'm not mistaken, well, not only the film was not acknowledged at the nomination, but I think it was Driving Miss Daisy that was the best film for that year.
It was that vicious corrective, Driving Miss Daisy, that won the Oscar. Yeah, Do the Right Thing wasn't nominated for Best Picture that year. No. It was nominated for Best Original Screenplay, but the only actor to be nominated was Danny Aiello. For Best Supporting Actor. He's very good, but...
I want to talk a little bit about what we mentioned, before you came in, and is the transition between, in the 70s, blaxploitation. Filmmakers like Gordon Parks and Melvin Van Peebles started this wave of blaxploitation, which was a very political kind of filmmaking. And Spike Lee always said he disliked that, he hated it, so he set on to do a completely different thing. And for a while, there was another set of filmmakers like John Singleton. I'm thinking that John Singleton, the Hudlin brothers, at the same time that we're working. But it seems that Spike is the only one that has kept making political cinema in such a high, both formally high way and aggressive, strongly argumentative.
Yeah, I mean, there was a big explosion at the time, as you mentioned. Black was very cool in the very late 80s and early 90s. So you mentioned John Singleton, the Hughes brothers, Matty Rich. This was a very male crowd too, Charles Lane. But then there was directors like Judy Dash, who came out of the LA Rebellion School. But she became the first black woman to direct a feature film and have it distributed in 1992, and that's the only feature she's made still. Yeah, and it's Daughter of the Dust, and it was just released this year on Blu-ray after a great restoration, and I think she went back to the mix because she never mixed it properly or something. Yeah. But it's a superior film, and you should try this film's called
it.
Daughters of the Dust, and if you haven't seen it, you've got to see it. I mean, it's a good question. He went and made Get on the Bus. He has Malcolm X, of course, but it's very telling that the studio stopped giving him money to finish Malcolm X. So he had to go and get money from Janet Jackson, Michael Jackson, Tracy Chapman, Prince, gave him personal funds to complete the movie. So he's never really had support. And he went on and did Kickstarter later. So I wouldn't want to characterize Spike as somebody that's always had institutional support. He's always had to scrap. He makes commercials, he teaches, he never stops. I mean, it's not like he's had it easy. But yeah, I mean, what happened to these other guys? They made more commercial material, I think, and that's fair enough. It's a business at the end of the day. John Singleton made Rosewood, which is an incredible movie, but that didn't get as much critical play or commercial play as his more accessible films. So I think there's a story there about what you're allowed to say and what you'll get paid for.
If you raise your hand if you want to ask any Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're thinking of the scene when Love Daddy's very hungry in the background, and there's a very serious discussion going on in the front of the frame. He's one of the great. The pretentious term is mise en scène, the French terminology for just essentially what is in the frame at any given time. And in everything he does, working with Ernest Dickerson and production designer Monty Ross in this film, that's why there's so much replay value to his stuff, because you're always missing things. And yet, so in answer to your question, yes. Can't give you specific examples right now, but Whenever I watch his films, we were talking about this before, even films of his that I've not reacted to particularly positively, I'm never bored by them, because whether it's formal or thematic, there's always something interesting happening, whether it's in the frame or in the themes that he's broaching. Well, one of the great books I've ever read is Spike Lee's production diary for this film. And he's one of those filmmakers where it just seems like somehow whatever was in his head just goes straight onto the screen, fully formed. He has these ideas, and the reference points you bring up are all very apt. There's also the Night of the Hunter reference with love and hate. You mentioned the Dutch angles and the way they come into the film when the tension rises in the pizzeria, for example. And yeah, I agree with you. I mean, he just seems to me, in the same way that Scorsese or another contemporary like Paul Thomas Anderson, who he made Boogie Nights when he was 26, which is crazy when you watch that now. And Magnolia, he's 28. You're just a natural filmmaker. I don't know if there is a special alchemy to that, but again, I was talking with my wife about that. Like when you're on track to do something, you decide when you're a kid, and all you do is watch films. And then those influences become a part of you, and they become part of the fabric of the film on a thematic and political level as well, and augment all of that. So it really is something else, this film. The colors, and it's the red, even watching it today, the Corner Boys.
Yeah, those colors.
It's like Eggleston. It's crazy. Yeah.
It's painting it's really, and it's interesting the reference you made before as studio film, because this was not a gigantic, obviously it was not a gigantic production, but it was his first studio film. And you really feel the knowledge of studio filmmaking, and I don't think you were here when I mentioned that. I think I read in either the production diary, I forgot where, but Ernest Dickerson mentioned Jack Cardiff. They mentioned watching Michael Powell's use of color. They mentioned the Third
The Red
Man.
Shoes as well.
Yeah. So it's interesting with Spike with me. Even again, some of the films I don't find accomplished completely, but they're always interesting. And even when they look messy, there is such an art in the cacophony of things he throws in.
I watched Jungle Fever last year for the first time ever on the big screen. I'd never seen it before. And I just found it completely overwhelming experience, the choreography of the camera movement. And it's also working with budgets that you don't see at that mid-level anymore. There's kind of blockbusters and comic book movies, and then micro-budget indies. And generally that mid-level of a film like $20 million budget, they don't tend to get made that much anymore. So to watch the level he's working at with Ernest Dickerson, who's his cinematographer with whom he made his first 6 features. So She's Gotta Have It, School Days, Do the Right Thing, Mo Better Blues, Jungle Fever, Malcolm X. And the work that they did together is incredible. I don't think so, no. Yeah.
Yeah, I think after the it gets to it after the shower. There's in the prelude of setting.
Costume's really important in the film as a theme. And as I mentioned, Ruth Carter, who's worked with Spike a lot and has just done Black Panther. I think the costumes are really interesting. He wears the Jackie Robinson throughout. That's very predominantly... So that, in a way, is in dialogue with the theme of representation in the film. So you have Bugging Out making a big noise about Want Some Brothers Up on the Wall, which, however unsophisticated, you know, his approach to that subject is bringing issues of representation into the mainstream, and Spike's doing a similar thing by proudly showing off Jackie Robinson. He's saying, here's a, you know, it's cocky in a way, you know, that kind of associating himself with that. That wasn't to everybody's taste. You know, there was one essay I read years ago which was just called Spike Lee, Corporate Populist, which argued that he couldn't be making truly progressive art if he was so entwined in kind of capitalist schemes of making money, working with Nike and doing the Jordans ads. You've got the giant close-ups as well, which is effectively product placement. Then the first image you see after the violence at the end is a discarded Nike sneaker. So there's something interesting going on there as well. And that's when I talk about what's in the frame. There's always something to look at and pick up on. But yeah, I wrote a whole essay about this as well, if anyone wants to check it out, for a website called Clothes on Film. So it was a lot of fun to write, you know, and I was going into precisely that kind of thing and about what the costumes represent. Every little Black Power pendant, everything is there on purpose. And all of it is there to confuse and to jostle and provoke. And I don't think there's a single reading that you could take, but it's a really good observation.
Yeah, it's also true, I think, for example, how much of his use of graphics, you know, the way he always introduced in film other languages. It's either it's graphics, it's animation and certain things, is non-narrative instances where he goes on and has these montages in the middle of something and it just sort of interrupts the flow. I mean, it's just his language, and I find it very exciting. You know, always did.
Agree.
Yes.
I think it was Barry Brown. Yeah, weirdly enough, you know, reading the production diary, as I mentioned, the film on the screen is pretty much exactly how it was planned. You know, in terms of the way it came together. It was shot in a very small location, so it, you know, even though it's thematically very complicated, they had that one block. They had 5 weeks to shoot it or whatever, and they went for it. So, despite the appearance of complexity, I think it was a fairly, you know, it was very close to how it was initially planned. Okay, cool. It's a good question. You never know what you're going to get with the Academy. It's a bit Forrest Gump, ironically. This year, Get Out won Best Original Screenplay, and I think it was the best. You know, the key word is original. Yeah. I know it's hard to take. Like it just seems so ridiculous, and the idea that it got 1 or 2 token nods is perhaps even worse. If they just snubbed it all together, you might be able to make a more coherent argument for that. I don't know. I don't know what was. There's obviously been a huge effort recently to diversify the Academy's voting body. You know, they've been embarrassed by Oscars so white time and again. So things are changing institutionally. I get a little frustrated, as I mentioned earlier, when the whole industry seems to shut down for a quarter of the year. You know, I work at a cinema. I work at BAM in Brooklyn, and our first run titles, often we don't have a great deal to pick from for a large part of the year, because so much of the bigger titles, in terms of distribution and exhibition, are sandwiched into a really small window for Oscar recognition. And the whole industry seems to point towards that, and it's almost as if there's only 4 or 5 films worth talking about for 3 or 4 months of the year, which is, you know, I understand it. You know, if you win an Oscar, all you need to do is watch, like, Jamie Foxx's acceptance speech for Ray to see how much that really means. And I do recommend you check that out. It's a great performance. But in answer to your question, I don't know. The Academy does what it does. There's been more strange snubs than do the right thing, and more kind of strange winners. I thought Moonlight was incredibly strange because it was actually the best film of the year, and that never happens with the Oscars. But yeah, it's hard to take. I think he should have. You know, Denzel Washington didn't win the next year for Malcolm X. Who won it instead? Was it Pacino for Scent of a Woman? For a blind screaming detective versus Malcolm X. But, you know, it's a shame. You know, I don't think... Who's talking about Driving Miss Daisy now? You know, I don't think it's a bad movie, but I do think it comes up most often when people are talking about Do the Right Thing.
But I think you have a point, actually, when you say that, you know, like the old cinema thing shuts down for like a third of, you know, fourth of the year, just because you have to talk about this thing. So there's more and more narrowing of the image of what an Oscar movie, you know, should be and as be. I mean, as a film writer, you know, for 3 months, I have nothing to write about because it's all those movies.
Professional full-time Oscar pundits.
Yeah.
There are entire websites dedicated to award speculation. Yeah. It's an industry unto itself.
Yeah, and it doesn't really encourage different kind of films, and then sometimes something makes it, like Get Out this year, you know, true, but it's sort of a problem.
They gave him an honorary Oscar a couple of years ago.
Spike Lee, yeah, which is kind of awkward because he's too young, you know, to have that. And
they must have felt really bad one night. And they gave it to Charles Burnett, another great African-American filmmaker, Agnes Varda. You know, these great artists that have been consistently overlooked. Yeah, and they're given,
they're given like the Career Award, which is not shown on the main Oscar ceremony, of course. They have a separate thing where...
It happens in November.
Yeah,
it happens like months
a
before.
completely different time. They have a nice dinner where everybody compliments each other. We see pictures, and and they get a gold star for that. But you never saw Charles Burnett, who's a true master, you know, on that stage.
This is another trail. You know, you talked about the John Singletons and the Charles Lanes, but there's a whole history of Black American independent film, mostly on the West Coast. Well, going way back, we could talk about Oscar Micheaux and the silent era and race movies, but thinking of the 70s, what was going on at the same time as blaxploitation, kind of overlapping, and in the same area. This is at the UCLA. But the thing with these filmmakers was that they were not necessarily commercially minded. So they were trying to make, I suppose, how would you put it, psychologically very interior films about domestic life and psychology and things like that. These films were never going to play to big audiences. They do play today, you know, they've had a resurgence, but what really made Spike Lee stand out as a black independent filmmaker was, as you mentioned, the marriage of politics and being commercially minded. So you've got an intensely political film that is also very, very watchable and entertaining and funny, and has Public Enemy on the soundtrack. And he puts himself in it. You know, he's in it, he writes, produces, directs, and he stars in it. He is a brand, he's branding himself. And that didn't sit well with some people. I don't mind. But that alienated him from some people, but you know, he was very unambiguous and unafraid to put himself out there.
Barbara?
Good to meet you finally. Oh, he's actually in my ear here, feeding me all the answers, by the way. I first met him when, actually, he was very, kind of kind. I wrote my book about Bamboozled, and he got in touch with us and said he wanted to come and do the Q&A. So I'd written this book about his film, which wasn't entirely praiseworthy. You know, it was. So I was like, oh God, what's he going to say? But I think he seemed. I assume he was happy that someone had taken that much level of interest and care and taken such a deep critical reading of a work that had been panned by the critics. Audiences didn't love it, and I think he respected and appreciated that. So we had a really nice Q&A. However, one thing I will say was that I was hoping to sell some books that evening. So I set up my stand, and my publisher was there, and then out the corner of my eye, I saw Spike's entire merchandise unit come in and set up next to me, and I was blown out of the water. But we made it up.
Oh, okay, we have one more.
There's a French film, La Haine, or Hate, by Cassavetes, which had a similar reception. It caused a lot of discussion and political controversy. Yeah. And hate being urban unrest, only in the suburbs of Paris, which is like the Parisian slum. And in the commentary to that film, at the very, very end, Cassavetes in effect says to young filmmakers, go out and make trouble, which sort of moved me to tears because, I was shooting at the time under difficult conditions, and I thought, God, how many independent filmmakers want to make a studio film to have more money, a better crew, better acceptance, get nominated, and the last thing on earth that they want is to go out and make trouble. And yet, here's Spike Lee, and he's got his studio contract, and that's exactly what he did. And it's so admirable. I wonder if you could talk about that, because it really was a troublemaker, and he knew it.
He was telling his truth. I think he found himself in a position where he was able to make this work, and he wanted to seize upon that opportunity. Interestingly, he was not happy about La Haine because he kind of accused it of ripping Do the Right Thing off without appropriate credit. But similarly with Spike Lee, Cassavetes in France has become a bit of a persona non grata in the industry. And I think that's a byproduct of, or a reaction to him being quote unquote outspoken and making the kind of work you talk about. Because you end up upsetting a lot of people. And it's not just the so-called right or conservatives you upset. You often upset a lot of self-described liberal people who are not yet willing to cop to or accept or process their own role in a particular social situation. And Spike is very harsh on those kinds of people, as was Cassavetes. But yeah, they both went out and made their truth, and they somehow managed to marry it with a very accessible aesthetic, and they were able to be commercial. And these films are talked about and watched today all over, so good on them.
Yeah, and I think about this film, I think Spike tried to make it at Paramount before. He tried a couple of other studios, and then it was Universal. And I think it was Sean Daniels who had helped some breakthrough directors of the late 70s, and I think it's one of the last executive.
There was
there
a big
are very
regime change.
very few executives that were
film
so
wasn't.
open to filmmakers that were just sort of so innovative, such strong personal voices, and so kind of untamable, which is really hard to find a studio film with working with people like this today.
And the industry is constantly moving and changing. So there are, as you said, there was a regime change which made this film happen. Malcolm X, he could barely get made. A few years ago, he ended up on Kickstarter trying to make funds to make a personal movie. And his next film, because he stuck around, he stayed in the game. His next film called Black Klansman, so it will be very straightforward and easy. And it's been produced by Jordan Peele, you know, who's at the top of his game now. So he's got staying power, the guy.
No, obviously, and he's fearless. I mean, is Jordan Peele and Jason Blum, who's a horror director, has nothing to do with Spike's work, you know. But he just takes what is there and makes it work so that he can talk. You know, he can express himself through the film. So if nobody else has anything, one last thing on my own. You said before that you felt like the industry, and you were, you know, because you were referring, I believe, to Black Panther, but you felt like the industry, there are some changes at the height of in the composition on the industry. I think that's the word you use. And can you elaborate a little bit of that?
I never like to get carried away, either good or bad, but I think I'll put it on one person. Someone like Ava DuVernay has never existed before. Someone who has that kind of clout and can produce a show like Queen Sugar and have Julie Dash come and direct. She has this incredible platform as a maker, as a producer, but also as almost a promoter. So she's someone who hasn't really existed in the industry before, and she's helping to bring other people through. But I wouldn't want to make any kind of sweeping, things are better now or things are great. But there's been some interesting work, and it's not just a black and white issue. It's really important to make that case. You know, there's many intersections, and there are still many communities and groups that are underrepresented or ill-represented or get forgotten about. So it's a constant fight, and it's the whole idea behind it is to never ever be complacent or think that we've made it now. So yeah, that's what I would say. My upbeat final answer.
Well, thank you,
Thank you,
Ashley. Thank you for being here.